Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Cristina Criddle. I'm a technology correspondent at the Financial Times in London. And I've got James Slezak here with me. He's the chief executive of Swayable. And we know that AI can understand and predict our behaviors extremely well. That's been happening for years and years and years. And one of the things that companies like James's is trying to do is to use that data to work out how AI can actually influence our behaviors and whether certain types of content and information can influence us in different ways. Tell us a bit more about your company and what it does.
Swayable is a data platform that measures persuasion. So that means that top marketers around the world or anyone with an important message uses the platform to measure whether their ads or messages are changing the way the public thinks. And that could be about an issue like getting vaccinated, or climate change, or it could be a product like what you have for breakfast in the morning.
And how reliable is it at being able to tell whether I'm going to like to eat cereal in the morning?
The more respondents you can get and the more sophisticated the analysis, the more reliable. And so a lot of what we're doing at Swayable is making dramatic improvements in how well that measurement can be done, and then correlating it against what actually happens in real life. And I think when you do that, you can see that it's enormously predictive of what happens if you're able to get thousands of people and show that the ones that saw an ad love your brand or agree on getting their kids vaccinated or whatever the issue is, than 1,000 that did not see the ad. That change is what we're measuring, and that's really the most predictive thing you can get if you want to change the outcome.
And how much have you seen a change with generative AI coming into the fore?
We're tremendously excited about generative AI, and I think we founded the company right at the kind of cusp of the current era. From the beginning, the models that we're using at Swayable use sophisticated machine learning approaches to model the population's beliefs and the changes in those beliefs. But Gen AI, of course, is like an additional kind of functionality on top of that, and really throughout the product stack, both at Swayable and I think any kind of cutting-edge data company, Gen AI is really taking in leaps and bounds forward what's possible. And that's simple things like, when you talk to a respondent, rather than just asking a fixed question, now the generative AI can start to adapt to what it's hearing from the respondent at scale. You could never do that with humans because you'd need thousands of people in a room instantly, responding. But also at the end that the customers our customers, the enterprises or brands, it's helping them to analyze what they're getting, helping them navigate through these massive quantities of data, find patterns, understand them more quickly. So it's extremely exciting.
And one of the big questions when you're using a lot of data is always, how are you protecting the privacy of the consumers?
We've been really excited. In fact, the panel I'm doing later is about privacy and regulation. I think most good regulation is really just codifying doing the right thing. And we were very glad that before the California Consumer Privacy Act came out and the European GDPR Act came out, basically the way we do these experiments was already compliant. Our approach really is just not to ask for information we don't need. So when we do experiments, because these are very large campaigns, what you as an individual thinks and where you live and your address actually doesn't matter to us. So trying to get that from you, is an intrusion on your privacy, and also isn't that valuable for us. So we've just never asked for personally identifiable data.
So how are you profiling people then?
So we're basically asking folks to tell us what categories they fall into. We'll ask them questions about their gender, about the area they live in, not their address, but what zip code or what postal code. And so a sequence of questions like that can build up a profile where there's no way I know exactly who you are, but for the purposes of what the marketer needs to do, which is to target people like you, you can make very precise conclusions.
And there's another layer to this above privacy, because you're influencing people's decisions and because some of your clients are political organizations as well. I mean, how are you making sure that this technology doesn't get into the wrong hands?
Yeah, look, it's a critical question. I mean, as you get more powerful technology, it's true that it can be used for really important good things, but it could be used for really bad things. So I think that really places the onus on the people managing the technology, building it, and the organizations that supply it to really have values that they can articulate, and to say no to some things. When we first started building Swayable, a lot of the kind of classic lore from Silicon Valley was just to say, look, take money from anybody that will give it to you. investors, customers, and have a sort of an agnostic approach to who can use the technology. And we really strongly disagreed with that. And as a result, there were many investors that didn't want to work with us, but we were very lucky that there were some top ones like Y Combinator and New Media Ventures that did. And I think they placed an understanding that a company has to articulate why it exists, and it's not just to make as much money for the shareholders as possible. It's got to have some real societal purpose. So we turned down a lot of work. I mean, quite practically saying no to things. I'd say most months.
And what are those red lines for you? What will you say no to?
So we divided up. We've got quite a thoughtful framework for how to live our values, and we have pretty straightforward values: truth, democracy, and fairness, including support for disempowered minorities and the rights of women. You'd think those things should be pretty uncontroversial, but unfortunately, they're not. And the fact that they're pretty clearly, important values means that, they're easy to write down. In commercial work, most stuff is fine. People are doing an honest day's work, trying to, bake muffins or, sell movies. And it's very rare that we actually encounter issues there. We do draw a line on fossil fuels and also weapons. So luckily, that's not a particularly large, part of the market, and so that's not a major sacrifice for us or the team. Politics, though, of course, is more complicated, and about half of political work we decline.
About half. And how big a proportion of your business is political work?
Right now, it's a minority. In an election year like now in the United States, it's about a third.
You're talking about your values as a chief executive, your values as a company. But they are political values. You're making a political decision to put this technology out in the world, but only make it available to certain types of people who have certain types of views or certain types of companies. Should you be the one making those decisions?
It's a great question. I mean, there's sort of a rock and a hard place that you have to navigate between, right? In a sense, you have to make the decisions because the alternative to making a decision is just say anything goes. And I think, you've only got to look around to say that if you say anything goes, you're going to be saying yes to some pretty bad stuff pretty quickly. So I think you're sort of forced to say, we've got to stand up for what's right or what's not right, and do that in some way that's as transparent as possible. So we don't really actually believe our values are political. I think democracy really shouldn't be something political. Most functioning societies don't have political movements that are anti-democratic. That's supposed to be the foundation that we compete on, not something that anyone's actually trying to undermine. So I don't think that that's in a healthy society actually a political value. And I think similarly, truth and fairness shouldn't be political. If certain actors in society choose to make them political, I think folks that want to act in good intentions have to say, look, I'm not going to, out of false balance, say, well, okay, now I don't want to be political, so you're allowed to do that. You have to draw a line somewhere and say, look, truth is truth, democracy is democracy. Respectfully, if those aren't values that you hold as an organization, we're not inclined to collaborate.
If this technology is incredibly powerful, then it can sway people, it can influence them, it can make them vote in a certain way. That could swing an election, and that would mean that the other side or the other sides that don't have access to this technology are at a disadvantage. And doesn't that actually hamper the democratic process?
Well, look, I mean, it's certainly true, and by our estimates, there definitely are races where people using Swayable quite regularly is decisive, and it's not only us saying that. There's been some really good political science on that. So we own that. I mean, that's our job, is to make people with an important message successful. And I think, it's sort of not an unfair advantage if the truth has, a more effective way to tell it. I think that's a totally fair advantage. That's the whole point of, debate. And, I think those ideas are not new ideas. You can go back, 2,500 years to Aristotle, and I think the same debates were there. Rhetoric is there to help people who have something important to say it effectively. And if your message is important, it's your obligation to say it well, because people are counting on you to win those debates.
And what drew you to doing this? Like, why are you working in this area?
I guess like anyone that cares about what goes on in the world, you sort of, get into arguments about what's right. And I think the one thing that always stood out to me, and, Americans and others that go home for family holidays and have arguments with their uncles, there's this amazing contradiction where it seems like nobody ever changes their mind about anything. You can't seemingly win an argument with somebody and persuade them. That's very rare. Yet, at the same time, you look at public opinion polling and numbers go up and down. So somebody's changing their mind. at scale for some reason. And, as a team, we really wanted to understand why. And when it comes to really existential questions like whether we act collectively on climate change or, whether our democracies are able to prevail and look after the rights of all of the people that live in them, we felt like that was a really important question to work on.
And in the kind of analysis and research that you've done, have you noticed a difference, I guess, in how willing people are to be swayed? Like, there's so much discussion about polarization in society, and that's not just on political issues, but people stick to a side these days. There's less ambiguity. Have you seen that in the data you've done? And what do you do when you come across people who are very hard to sway?
Well, look, it's absolutely true. On different issues, there's a really wide variety of or range of how persuadable people are. In the United States, on the national election questions, people are very difficult to persuade. They've found, made up their mind, and their friends think similarly to them. But on local races and on issues, often we find more persuadability. When it comes to brands and marketing, of course, there's a lot more latitude there. People maybe identify with certain brands, but it's not so core to many of their identities. So there's a big range, and figuring out where are the pockets of who's persuadable and how, I think, is critical if anybody's doing marketing or running any kind of campaign, because ultimately that's your job. You have those resources, you're spending that time, you're spending those media dollars to make a change in how many people love your muffins or want to go and vote. And so knowing which people you've got a likelihood of prevailing with is a critical part of that.
And why do you find that AI is a better, I guess, assessor of how swayed somebody can be?
It's a really cutting edge moment where I think for the first time ever in human history, machines are now as good as humans at persuading people. And that really hasn't been fully deployed yet. So, there's research really just with dates on these papers sort of in the recent weeks where people are showing open AI models or, anthropic models that are generating messages, and they're being shown to people. And the impact of those messages is at least as good, if not better, than ones created by humans. So this is kind of a bit of a watershed moment now, because I think the implications of that are, in a certain sense, very clear. We're going to probably get a lot better at this. It's going to be a lot, easier, faster, cheaper. But also, for a lot of people, scary. On what basis are we going to do this? How shall it be regulated? What values are going to be at the core of the organizations that do that kind of optimization? I think getting the right answer to those questions will have a lot of implications for how society evolves.
It's interesting because in marketing and in advertising, quite often what you're trying to do is trigger an emotional response in somebody. So much of our decisions when we're looking at ads is because we feel a certain thing. Is there do you program that into the AI at all? How do you manage to find out whether a certain emotion is going to work over another?
Yeah, we do a lot of research on the platform into people's emotional responses. It's one of the really key things that the platform measures. And we do it in very straightforward ways. We'll just say to you, how did this ad make you feel? If you hated it, you'll say you hated it typically. If you thought it was funny, you'll say it's funny. So there are patterns in what kinds of emotions are associated with really effective ads, and even what kinds of communities those emotions are most effective with. So a lot of what the platform's doing is looking for those patterns. There are certain moments in time where communities are angry and upset about something, and messages that tap into that vibe, we found are often more effective than ones that maybe humorous or not. But there may be a very another community right next door that on the same topic, actually a humorous approach makes sense. Voting, that's one example where we see that a lot. Some people vote out of passion, others out of kind of despair and anger. But other really critically important issues like vaccination, for example, we've done a lot of work with public health authorities on that, and there's quite complicated emotions of fear and hope and trust that come into play. So getting that right is quite literally a life or death matter for people, given how important the actions are.
And when there are those competing emotions, how do you or how does the AI make a judgment?
Typically, it's that certain emotions will work with certain kinds of folks. And that's why segmenting effectively is so important, because we found in the United States, for example, in the last election, that a lot of folks from the African American community responded very well to passionate messages that involved emotions that kind of tapped into that kind of feeling of, in many cases, being upset with the system. And so versus other communities, humor was more effective with, but actually fell flat with the communities that were more upset at that moment. And so in those situations, showing the campaigners which communities I think are responding with which emotions and which emotions are most correlated with the successful messages, I think is a way for them to understand not only how to succeed at their job, but really how to listen to people in these communities who in many cases are not being heard.
And then in terms of the creative and the output there, that's still very much done by a human still?
We don't make creative, which is nice. We like to play nice with our agency and creative friends, and we don't compete with them.
Do you see there ever being an overlap?
Yeah, I think certainly as Gen AI becomes more and more important, and especially as more message testing becomes kind of the focus of a lot of these more sophisticated test and learn based campaigns, the creation and the testing becomes a little blurred. When you've just got an idea and you're just writing some words down that might later go into a creative brief, and that brief then becomes ads, is that creative or is that just sort of messaging strategy? I think, there's some blurred lines.
Yeah, it's so interesting. One of the things I've seen the most, especially in advertising, is using Gen AI for a concept. So you might put the mood, we want it to be angry and passionate, and then it will generate the image. And that's something to work off, I guess.
The most sophisticated partners we're working with are really actively developing programs that take advantage of that. So rather than months of invested time and money to make a couple of big TV ads, and you're just about to spend $1 million or reals or pounds on promoting them, and you do a quick test to check if they work. That's sort of the obvious thing to do. But the far more effective thing to do is to go, wait a second, we spent 2 months making a whole bunch of decisions, and we didn't have a lot of good evidence in that 2 months. What if we found some evidence? What if we tested the core idea at the beginning of this process, and actually the other 4 ideas that somebody else had in the team room, and nobody, they got shot down, or somebody said the research didn't really support them, but the research was a focus group with 10 people in it, So now these teams are actively putting that stuff through the machine, and they're seeing, wow, we can take better decisions at all points in this sort of tree of decisions we take, and by the time we land on the right branch at the end and we put all our budget into it, it's a lot more effective.
Great. That's all we have time for, I'm afraid. It was super interesting chatting to you, and thank you so much for listening in.